Welcome to Barnyard Language, honest talk about running farms and raising families. We are Katie and Arlene, an Iowa sheep farmer and an Ontario dairy farmer, with 6 kids, 2 husbands, and a whole lot of chaos between us.
While this is a podcast for farm families, sometimes our content isn't for the whole family. So kick off your boots, reheat your coffee, and join us for some Barnyard Language.
Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of Barnyard Language. It's another month, another episode, and I'm going to ask Katie again what's happening. Were there spooky things? How was Halloween? Is your house full of candy? Are your kids hyped up on sugar? What's going on?
We had a neighbor handing out booze last night, and that was kind of the highlight of the whole thing.
Hopefully not for the kids.
No, for me and Jim. The upside of it being cold last night was that the kids were good to quit after 15 houses maybe, which was really enough walking. It's a small town, so 15 houses can still be a bit of a hike. They were real hopped up on sugar, and I see that Charlotte's teacher assigned homework last night, which is probably the one time that I'm going to tell my kid I am totally fine with them not doing their homework, and if their teacher needs a note, I will provide one, because I understand that education is important, but giving a 7-year-old a spelling sheet on Halloween is a little untenable. Let's put it that way.
Yes, there's probably not a very good chance that that's going to happen in very many households.
I'm going to guess that my kid was not the only one who did not complete it. So, maybe we can do it over the weekend and send it back.
Sure. And was the snapping turtle costume complete and adorable?
His head has been missing since Sunday, and with a coat on, and with the fact that the shell is in the back, people don't give a shit. They just gave him candy. Nobody cares. He seemed happy. I mean, he got candy, so that's the part he cares about.
And what's the harvest report?
Harvest is done. Stalks are baled. It actually rained yesterday for the first time in months, maybe, since we've had any rain that amounted to anything. That's about it.
So corn stalks for you guys are for bedding. Is that why you're baling stock? Okay.
Yep. We got about twice as many bales as we needed, which is awesome because it's always better to have more. One interesting little tidbit I found out, I just had the washer repair guy here, and he mentioned that if you were a farm that has your water heater set real high for the purposes of disinfecting things, that you want to make sure not to use that super hot water on your laundry, because that super hot water degrades the seals even faster than normal. So, tidbit for the week right there.
That's good to know. So do you have seals that have been degraded?
No, none of my seals have disintegrated, but I simply...
But don't use the hot function. Just go with warm if we have really hot water.
Yeah, don't... If your water's heater is set to be hot enough for things like sanitizing dairy equipment, don't use it on your laundry. Or be prepared for...
Yeah, our house and our barn are set at different temperatures, so I think ours is all right. But that is good to know if people have cranked up their water heaters in their houses, for sure. Or have laundry facilities in their barns. Lots of people have that too.
I mean, around here at least, usually people put kind of junker washers in their barn, but they still have seals. And
yeah, that's right. You'd still like it to last a little while.
And it turned out to be a very basic problem that I had, and we were still under warranty. And as he pointed out, it was a lot better that all the water went into the drawer of the pedestal instead of onto the floor. So he was absolutely correct about that.
So there was a minor leak, but it got contained.
It was just a bit of a surprise when I opened the pedestal drawer and it was full of water.
Yes, that's not what you usually want to see.
How are things at your place?
Things are good. We actually were recording the day after Halloween, which is why we're talking about it. And it was hot. Not like Texas hot, but I'm not nothing like that. But for Halloween in Canada, it was really warm. There were lots of people out in their garages handing out candy rather than even being inside their houses. You didn't have to put a snowsuit underneath anybody's costume. If anything, we were peeling off layers. It was actually really warm last night, which was a much more pleasant experience than the years where, yeah, you're battling the elements and freezing cold. So we're reaching the stage where obviously my oldest is not at home. My 16-year-old doesn't trick or treat anymore, which is fine. That's age appropriate. My 13-year-old went out with friends, so he still goes out, which is nice. He had a fairly scary costume, and he's inches taller than me. He's about 5'11" now. So he said that there were lots of adults who complimented on him on his costume and lots of little kids who were scared of him. Not that he tried to scare them, but he could hear the whispers of little children on the street trying to avoid him. And then I went out with, well, both my husband and I went out with our youngest and a friend of his and her little brother and her parents. So we actually did town trick or treating, which is different for us. I guess last year we did that as well. But until the last couple of years, we've always just done country trick or treating where we would hit up various numbers of houses depending on the age of kids. When they were little, it was not very many. By the time they were getting a bit older and not everyone was needing to be buckled in by an adult at every single stop, we got up to about a dozen probably and got pretty good loot because we were, for most of them, the only family that ever came to their door. So it's just a change and I'm fine with it, but I'm still happy that the youngest wants me to go trick-or-treating with him. So that was still fun. And it is neat to be in town and just be able to walk around and see lots of other people out versus the way we used to do it, where it's just like go chat with your neighbor and then jump in the car and hit the next house.
Yeah, we did drive to Grandpa and Grandma's last night before we went trick or treating, and then we stopped at a neighbor's on the way home. And because their son was the only trick or treater we ever got, so he got a lot of toys and full size candy bars for Halloween. And our kids are the only trick or treaters they ever get, so they go to like the Dollar Tree. And I mean, they handed my kids a grocery bag of candy yesterday on top of the amount of candy they had already gotten.
What they'd already
Yeah.
collected in town. Yeah.
Yeah. So last night driving home, I looked and my daughter had 2 ring pops in her mouth at the same time.
That's impressive. Not on her fingers, just in her mouth.
No, just in her mouth. She was real proud.
And harvest is done here too. The combine left the other day, I guess maybe yesterday, the day before. So corn in both of its forms is done. Silage was done a while ago. The rest of the corn is now in bins or in storage or wherever it needs to hang out. Some of it has been sold. And then manure went out. So the pit is empty. The neighborhood is stinky, but all the things are lining up nicely to be done before the first snowfall, which doesn't always happen.
It is a lot easier when it gets done before that starts happening.
Yes, that's right.
Especially because I'm assuming that, like it is here a lot of times, the first snowfall is not the first snowfall that sticks, and so it can get real muddy.
Yes, no, yeah, it just means that yeah, things are done, which is nice. It's always better to have things out of the field than still there taunting you. And we can now see the school bus coming for much longer distance, so that's nice too. The corn's not in the way anymore.
If anybody has a good idea of how I can denote that the cattle are in the correct pasture and that they are inside the fence, because now without the corn and without the painter's plastic on the windows, there are some fields that when the cattle are rotated into them, it sure looks like maybe they're just running away from the house.
But you've got no visual barriers anywhere.
Yeah, yeah, because I can't see the fence, but I can see the cows.
Right. Maybe some fancy ribbons or crocheted items on the posts or something.
Yeah, like some of those bike flags, the real tall ones with the orange pennant at the top. Because
Then at least you know there's where the fence is relative to where the cow is.
yeah, yeah, because it's a little disconcerting every time it happens that I look out there and they're just somewhere different.
Yeah, that's right. All right. Well, why don't we welcome our guest for this week?
All right.
Today we are excited to be talking to Nate, who's joining us from Georgia, and this means that we get to cross another state off of our list of states that we've had guests from, so that's exciting for us. And Nate, we start each of our interviews with the very same question, so this is a way to introduce yourself to our listeners, and we always ask, what are you growing? So for our farmers, that's usually crops and livestock, but can also include kids and businesses and all kinds of other stuff. So what are you growing?
I'm growing a few things. Before I jump into that, I wanted to congratulate you guys on, I think this is beginning of season 4, and I feel like you guys have been growing a ton. I listened to a recent episode with the Peterson brothers. Like, that is, agricultural online royalty that you guys had on. So you guys are growing in such a big way, and so it's an honor to be on here today. We live in suburbia. We live outside of Atlanta. And so I have the spirit of a farmer. I grew up on a farm, but I don't have very much space. So we live on a little quarter-acre lot, and we have 13 raised beds in the backyard. So wrapping up summer crops, we have some okra and some butternut squash that we're finishing up. And then the great thing about the climate that we're in is we can grow all sorts of stuff in fall. So we have lettuce and carrots and things for the kids to get their hands in, and me not to mess up too much. And speaking of kids, that's what I'm most passionate about growing. We have very blessed with an 8-year-old son and a 6-year-old daughter, and they keep us humbled and they keep us busy, and they are definitely our why.
Kids are definitely good at both of those things.
So, Nate, what is your ag background like then?
So I mentioned growing up on a farm and kind of having that spirit of a farmer. I've lived in the Atlanta area for 20 years, but before that, I grew up on a small family farm in north central Oklahoma. It's where my parents still live. Farms are awesome. I love farms. The thing people love about my parents' farm the most is that they live in an underground house. Like, right there, you don't have to tell anyone anything else about the farm. They think it's the coolest thing ever, and we can go down the underground house rabbit hole if you'd like. But I say small, it's 450 acres. That was small growing up. Our cousins farmed thousands of acres. You come here and you're on a quarter acre, you tell people 450 acres, and they think it's monstrosity. Mainly cattle and wheat farming growing up, but we had everything. We did 4-H and FFA, and we had show pigs, and all of a sudden there's rabbits at the farm, there's turkeys. Like, you know how it goes. There's a horse for like 3 weeks, but then someone gets bucked off of it, so dad gets rid of the horse. But I loved my upbringing on the farm. I think my wife thinks I have selective amnesia. I only think about the good things. I somehow block out all the chores and all the things I hated. And it could be an early midlife crisis, but I just love the nostalgia, and the lessons learned on a farm, I think, are hard to replicate. And we try to think about that for our kids and try to think about integrating that for our kids as we try to grow them.
So, your folks' underground house, and the fact that you're from Oklahoma explains a lot about the accent because you don't sound real Georgian. Do they live in like a decommissioned missile silo? Because that is what I'm picturing, and that's how I'm going to keep picturing it no matter what you say.
Go ahead and picture it that way. I like when people picture just flat Oklahoma ground with a trap door that we had to go down a ladder to. That is not it. If you know much about Oklahoma, it's very flat. So they start with a flat piece of ground. They construct these large concrete domes. Their house is made of these, I think, 3.5 large concrete domes, and they cover it with dirt. And there's windows on the side, there's a skylight in the middle. And by far, the best thing about growing up in an underground house, we're in northern Oklahoma. So you guys are about to scold me talking about snow to someone from Canada and Iowa. But you'd get snow like the perfect amount. You'd get snow like 3 or 4 times as a kid, but everything's flat, but not our house. We would just walk up the side of the house. It's grass, dirt covered with grass, sled down the house. Greatest thing ever as a kid growing up.
So, it's really more of a hobbit house.
The Hobbit house is the perfect way people describe it, for
I
sure.
mean, I'm attached to the missile silo concept, but I'll go with hobbit house. And
My parents are going to be thrilled to listen to this, thinking I'm going to tell the history of the family's farm and the barn that my grandfather built, and we'll spend at least 10 minutes talking about the Hobbit house.
well, total sidebar for your folks too. There's a guy in Texas who owns a bat sanctuary where they literally built their own cave for bats. And it's like it's huge. And I just think it's the most amazing thing in the world, and it sounds quite similar in process to your folks' home.
That tracks with Texas. If you've ever heard about Austin or been to Austin, that gentleman probably went to Austin, saw the bats come out from under the bridge, and saw I have to have my own in my house, so he built it. Love that.
Yeah, I think that was exactly it. But I like the kind of people who do shit like building above ground, underground houses, or having a sick amount of money and being like, you know what, sports cars are just totally over. I need a literal bat cave. I just think that's awesome.
Yes, and I'm gonna start using that above ground underground house that they live in. That's the way to describe
All
it.
right, we can get back to the actual interview now, Arlene. Sorry.
So I'm just thinking about the fact that both Katie and I are on multi-generational family farms, and we ended up with the traditional farmhouse. Was there a farmhouse there that then was like, no, we don't want that. We need to build something underground? Or was there another motivation for such a cool sounding non-traditional farmhouse?
Yeah, so there's a couple pieces to that story. So the farm is originally my mother's parents' side, and the original farmhouse is still there. That's where my family's barn is that I'd love to tell you about. That's where mainly the sheds and the equipment are. And then my parents, as many people, wanted to move back to the farm and start a family and be part of the farm with my grandfather. And they got this piece of adjoining land and they needed to build a house. And this is in the early 80s when concrete prices weren't outrageous like they would be if you tried to do this now. So it was very economical to do it. And it was very efficient. It's a very efficient home. They'll hardly ever run the AC in the summer, which is crazy in Oklahoma, as hot as it can get. And then they run mainly a wood stove in the winter. And then it's Tornado Alley. So when other people were, are running out to their cellar, we were kind of just stay away from the windows, kids. You'll be okay.
That was actually going to be my next question, as someone who lives at sort of the northern end of the tornado hot zone, I guess. Yeah. Underground seems like a good.
Yeah. So there were some good reasons for it in addition to easy kid sledding.
Do you ever wonder if pioneers came back now, people who lived in sod houses because they had no choice? If a pioneer who lived in a sod house, so like Laura Ingalls Wilder, comes back to life, sees your parents' house, how pissed do you think she'd be? Because, I mean, they did everything they could to not live in a house made with dirt. And you guys are just like, it'd be cool as if we covered our house with dirt.
That's fair. They're going to say, wow, you guys didn't progress very far.
There's probably fewer bugs coming into your folks' house, and I'm guessing that they actually have a floor that's not made of dirt. So that probably helps.
They do have a floor that's not made of dirt. They were ahead of the trend. And for the longest time, they only had concrete floors, which then if you waited 20 years, that became very in vogue when you think of like barn dominiums, like stained concrete floor. They recently got tile put in. So that's gone. But yeah, it's got electricity, plumbing, and a little bit of internet. So hopefully they'd be impressed with that.
So we've been talking about houses for a few minutes, but clearly our connection to each other is barns. So being Barnyard Language, it was pretty cool to find your account on Instagram, which is called Barns of Georgia. So obviously you are someone who is passionate about agriculture and agricultural history. So can you tell us a bit about the inspiration behind Barns of Georgia and what you're trying to do and why?
I could go on about this forever. I love barns, per your intro to my account on Instagram called Barns of Georgia. I think actually talking about houses transitioning to barns is a pretty good place to start. When you really look at the history of barns, they were kind of the focal point of the farmyard. Like you had to store your things there. Your animals were so important. Your crops were so important. And actually, I like to say that barns are in my blood. My grandfather on my dad's side immigrated from Germany, and I've seen his original house, and it was actually originally a barn. The family lived upstairs, the animals were downstairs, which sounds crazy to us now, but at the time and in the location, that was very normal. It's funny to me. You fast forward and everything cycles through, and now people are building barn doors are such a big thing. But that's one side of my family. The other side of my family, my great grandfather on the farm I grew up at built the barn that I grew up with. So that's, I think, why I love barns so much. And then kind of the origin story of why I started this page on Instagram is I've mentioned wanting to expose my kids to kind of the agricultural life. And I had this dream of buying a small farm here in Georgia. Your listeners who are really farmers will cringe when I say the word hobby farm or weekend farm, because what is that? But it's amazing what happens when you leave the farm after 20 years. And so I spent 3 years looking for a piece of land, and I wanted the perfect piece of land, right? You always do. But my one thing was it has to have a barn. And after a lot of frustrations, striking out on deals, not being able to make something happen, uh, one day I had this revelation that said, instead of owning a barn myself and exposing my kids to that, what if I saw every single barn in the state of Georgia? What would that be like? What an adventure. What a story. What a way to integrate my kids into not just barns, not just rural Georgia, but seeing the entire state, exploring adventures. And that's how I got started. I was bold enough to just pull the trigger and start the account. And it's been about a year and a half. And I've met some incredible people. I've learned a ton. I've gotten to the creator space and hopefully have more skills than I used to have. And I've seen some really, really incredible barns, probably 200 or so here in the state of Georgia. And I've gone outside of, people like to say, you're breaking your rules. You're called Barns of Georgia. And I say, hey, I love barns anywhere. So one side of my family, my wife's from Virginia. I'm from Oklahoma. So you'll see a splattering of Oklahoma and Virginia barns on there as well.
So I'm someone who likes to keep organized. So can you describe your system? Like how are you tracking your barns and how are you making sure that you're going to hit every single one? Because I'm intrigued. I'm also a big map person. I'm a geography major. So I'm picturing a big wall map and maybe some pins or something, or maybe you've got a more technical version of that.
I wish I did. I may need to. I think we connected because I saw your map and you were missing the state of Georgia, and I'm a sucker for maps. I am unfortunately not very organized. I would be embarrassed to show you how I handle this, but it's the most common question I get when I tell people about my account is they say, "Oh, so you just go drive around?" I'm like, I wish it was that easy, and I wish I had that much time on my hands. No, I spend way too much time on the satellite version of Google Maps. Basically, I'm very good at finding a rusty roof. I'm very good at finding that shape of what a barn looks like. And then we're fortunate now to have street view, even in rural places. And so I can find those barns. And I pinned them on Google Maps. And right now, if you looked at my map of the state of Georgia, there would be probably 400 pins. And I try to do that research as much as possible so that if I'm driving to a part of the state, we're going on a weekend trip, etc., I can quickly pull it up. I have them color coded so I can say I've been to these, I haven't been to these. That's as sophisticated as it's gotten so far. So I'm going to need to do some work to make sure I check them all off for sure.
So are there barns where you contact the owner or the family beforehand, or are you mostly just going to kind of observe from street level, maybe, take a picture, that kind of stuff? Or what's your interaction, I guess, with the barns and their owners?
Typically the latter. Typically I'm taking a picture from the road. If I had it my way, I would meet every single owner. It is the best. And I completely understand some people love their privacy, don't want to take the time to talk to me. And growing up on a farm, I respect that to the utmost degree. But when I meet an owner, 99.9% of the time, tell them about the account, they want to spend 3 hours telling me about the history of the barn. And so it's a double-edged sword. I love those stories. Those are amazing. But it's hard for me to get out with kids, with work, with all the things. It's hard for me to get out and see as many barns as I wish I could. And so when I meet an owner, I'm like, well, I guess I'm going to see one barn today. It's going to be an incredible story versus I try to batch my work when I go drive for 2 or 3 or 4 hours round trip. I'm trying to see 20 to 30 barns so that I'm building up that content. And then I'm putting out that content over the weeks and months ahead.
Nate, my one suggestion here, Arlene was just here last week for the Iowa Barn Foundation All-State Barn Tour. We had some visitors who actually had a spreadsheet they had made of all the barns and the details of them. Our state coordinator got a magnet made for the side of his car that says Iowa Barn Foundation, and I think that has been tremendously helpful with approaching owners because it's not just some creepy guy pulling into their driveway.
Not to say that you're creepy at all.
No, but I feel like you're less likely to get shot at if you have some sort of identification.
And when you're talking about listening to owners talk about their barns, I loved it. But the only barn I saw on the Iowa State Barn Tour was Katie's family's. And I wandered through, I think, 2 or 3 times with both her husband and his father and listened in on their interpretations and their stories of the barn, and each of them was a little bit different, and each person that came through got a slightly different story and little bits of history depending on what they were interested in. So it's definitely true that people are passionate about their barns.
Yes, and what timing that you all did that recently. And I think that's great advice. I do have a small magnet on the back bumper of my truck that's my Barnes of Georgia logo, but I love that idea of something more visible and less likely to get shot at. That's always possible.
Yeah, those big magnets are not expensive versus, I guess, an ER bill or a lawsuit or whatever. And I can safely say my husband volunteers for the Iowa Barn Foundation for our region. 3 hours is a short conversation when you get people going about barns. So pivoting just a tiny bit, because there's a strange, I don't know that it's even a strange crossover. Are you also into wood tall ships or steam trains? This, like, I think it's a universal triangle sort of thing. Like, if you're into barns, you're into at least one of these other things.
You got me at steam trains. We took the kids up to North Georgia along the Tennessee border for a ride last fall, and it's pretty cool, especially when you what's it called when they can turn them on the turntable at the end when they can turn the locomotive. It's incredible and just nostalgia once again. So yes, there's a correlation. The Venn diagram is strong with those two things, right?
Are there any barns along the steam train route? Because that seems like the perfect crossover.
Oh my goodness. I was definitely I'm always brainstorming like how do I incorporate an animal or something else cool into a photo. And so certainly a train going in front of a barn would be incredible.
So what you're saying is that if you could take a tall ship cruise to a place that had steam trains that would go through countryside full of barns, I mean, we'd be right there with you. So don't get me wrong on that. Like, there's less than no judgment.
I do have a really cool picture now that I'm quickly brainstorming train tracks with a red barn. It's in Virginia, but it would have just been a normal train, so the train didn't make the cut. But if it was a steam train, I would have waited around for that one.
I assume you've seen the photography of O. Winston Link.
No, fill me in.
He was a black and white photographer in oh god, the olden days. I sound like my kid now. The olden days. Did a lot of night photography of cars and steam trains and small towns, and totally worth a Google.
That shows how I view myself as not a photographer, even though I have hundreds of pictures now on Instagram of barns. I have strong imposter syndrome when it comes to a photographer. Every single one of my photos is taken with my iPhone. I'm that lazy, but hopefully my iPhone picture taking skills have increased over the last year and a half.
iPhones can take good pictures.
It's pretty incredible.
So I know we were chatting a little before we started recording, but as someone who's facing, I would imagine, many of the same issues as your wife and children at this point. I have a 7-year-old and a 6-year-old, and my husband volunteers with the Barn Foundation. How do you balance a hobby that can really eat up time and money? Those gas station snacks when you take your kids along are not cheap, with having a quote unquote real job and a family, assuming that you're not, independently wealthy and just cruising around for barns.
Not yet. Not yet. It hasn't. We haven't flipped the switch of Barnes of Georgia becoming this ultimate profitable revenue stream where I can just early retire. It is a great question, and it's something that, going back to when I first started it, I forgot to tell you this story. I'd been looking for a farm, quote unquote, land, 5 acres, 50 acres, whatever, for years. And when I told my wife the idea about Barnes of Georgia on Instagram, this relief went over her body and her face. And she said, I quote, "This is a hobby I can get on board with." She was like, "You're just going to drive around and look at barns. I'm not going to be worried about you trying to start a farm and 2 hours away from our house." So that was good. The wife was happy. And then I think when I think about what I do, being able to bring my kids along, being able to meet these farmers, like one of my favorite stories, I just kind of try to integrate it into our daily life, if that makes sense. So we went to Charleston, South Carolina for the 4th of July, and we were driving back. And of course, I scouted barns on Google Maps because I am who I am. and I found what looked like a really good place. I found this beautiful red barn. I'm taking a picture of it. The farmer pulls up. I say hi. I start talking to him. Nicest guy ever. He says, "You have to come across the road." "Oh, you got little kids in your car? You have to come across the road. We have goats. They're the friendliest goats ever. You got to see the dog, etc." My wife is like, "We got to get back to Atlanta." I'm like, "No, this is the best. Look at the kids. Look how happy this farmer is," because this farmer had adult kids that lived across the road. I don't think he had grandkids. And so this was like a treat for him. And then as we pull away, you guys will be able to picture this. As we pull away, he's in front of us. He stops in the middle of the road. We cannot go around him. I see him get out. He's walking over to the sunflower field. And I'm like, I know exactly what this guy's doing. He picks sunflowers, 3 sunflowers. He didn't get one for me, one for my wife, one for my daughter, one for our son, and brings them to the car. And I'm like, that is why I love this little hobby of mine, for memories like that and to show my kids what this means. I was in South Carolina with a random farmer who spent time with us and treated us so well.
Podcasts are free to listen to, but they aren't free to create. Katie and I would appreciate your support as we work to build the Barnyard language community.
Patreon is an easy way for you to make a contribution that goes directly to making the show. As a member of our Patreon community, you get to watch the video version of our weekly updates, complete with questionable hairstyles and clutter. With 3 levels of support, you can choose a tier that works for you.
Keep the podcast going by becoming a patron today at patreon.com/barnyardlanguage.
So this shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone who's listened already at this point, but I'm guessing you probably have a favorite barn or a favorite type of barn, and probably both. So what is your favorite barn that you've seen so far? And are there particular kind of barn that is your peak barn viewing?
Yeah, if anyone who's seen my account, they will see me post often that'll say my new favorite. So typically my favorite is the most recent one I found. It's like a scavenger hunt and adventure to me. If people really press me on this question, my profile picture is of this big white gambrel barn in North Georgia. It's actually on public land. If you've ever heard of Berry College is in Northwest Georgia. It is the largest college in the world based on acres. They own something like 40,000 acres. It is a very special place. They have beautiful barns on campus, but this is on their land. It's public land. You can also hunt on this land. And so I've been to this barn many times because you can kind of explore it, get up close. You're not on someone's personal property. And it's got this backdrop of the mountains, and it's just an incredible barn. My favorite barn overall is a barn I have not posted yet, and it's my childhood barn. It's the barn that my parents own. It's the barn where all my memories are. Like, you know this. I think Katie had a post of this, on your account of maybe her and somebody else in the grain bin, and there's cobwebs all over the place and there's dust everywhere. And I can close my eyes. I can smell those smells. I can have those memories of working cattle through the barn, shipping pigs out of the barn, stacking thousands and thousands of hay bales in that loft. And so, of course, that's going to be my favorite barn in the world because all those memories are tied to it.
When you talk about the smells, I'm thinking of the childhood barn that we had. It's burnt down when I was in high school, but it had a hay mow on either side, but we bedded some areas with shavings. And so there was a pile of wood shavings in the middle, and we would jump from the hay mow into those shavings. And we're always surprised when my mom would figure out and get mad at us, but it wasn't that hard to figure out when your clothes and shoes and the whole body are, covered with wood shavings. But the smell of that shavings pile and playing in it as kids is like a distinctive memory for me, for sure. Something about playing in barns.
Whatever they say about smell and being tied to memory is so true, right? You can just bring back those memories. And once again, we're being selective with our memories because no one has mentioned manure and things dying and all the things that happen on a farm and around a farm. The other smells, as we like to call them.
Nate, that's actually one of the reasons that our barn is so popular on Barn Tour, is we're one of the very few that is still a working barn. And people will walk in. I was telling Arlene about this weekend, is that people walk in and usually the first thing they say is, "It smells like a real barn in here." And I'm like, well, yeah, it's full of cattle. So yes, it does smell like a real barn in here. But
Well, it's mostly full of tractors, but there's also some cattle in there too.
I try to block that out, Arlene. Thank you.
Her husband has a bit of an old tractor obsession too, so that's probably combined with barns. Yeah, yeah.
And my father-in-law and my kid.
I've listened to at least one of the husband episodes, so I know some of these things. And yes, the smell of a tractor that somehow makes its way into a barn too. My son knows that smell. We don't live on a farm, but he knows that smell. He'll smell a school bus, a diesel school bus, and his grandfather's Opa. He'll say that smells like Opa's tractor, and I love that.
How do you explain barns to non-barn people? Because I think especially for folks who grew up with some sort of building on their property, it could be literally the most rundown, horrifying, dangerous, dry rotted, full of rats, full of random tractor parts and empty beer cans. Just shit show death trap of a place. And it would still inhabit such a place in their heart. And I know as a farmer, one of the most horrifying things I hear is when people have a barn fire and people say, well, it's just a barn. I mean, like a barn like ours, you literally could not replace it. There's no one who builds anything like this anymore. And even if it's a Morton building, it's still your barn. It's not like a garage. I feel like that's the thing people miss is that they think it's just a big place where you put shit. And I mean, maybe there are people who feel that way about their barns, which is horrible and sad, and I feel like their barns should be put up for adoption.
I think those people are the exception to the rule, right? I was thinking about this before we started recording, and I started my account on Instagram, and I was like, what am I doing? Who is going to care about this? How much time am I going to spend on this? I was talking to a close friend of mine, and he said, Nate, who doesn't love barns? And a year and a half later, I found that to be very true. And it's outside of the agricultural community. So I've gotten to know so many people here in Atlanta in the creator space who've taught me a lot about how to do things on Instagram, how to work on social media, how to connect with more people. And those people love barns. And I don't have a ton of followers, but a person here in Atlanta who has over 150,000 followers. She's been super supportive to me. And she said, Nate, think about this. There are hundreds of people now in Georgia and throughout the country that whenever they drive by a barn, they think of Barns of Georgia. And I was like, that's pretty cool. That's really cool. I think it's a universal connector. You may not think that when you think of people who've never escaped, say, Metro Atlanta and haven't been out to rural America, which is something I'm passionate about, just making sure, especially kids, have that experience. I think once they do, though, there's something that just like speaks about a barn. To me, the older and maybe even more dilapidated, the cooler it is. But fancy ones, I like to say horse people, they love their fancy barns. Those are amazing too. And you just can't beat it. I think they're a special structure.
We've actually got a real nice barn for sale up here if you have a couple $1,000,000 and some horses you want to put in it. Some folks put in a real nice arena, and then I don't know what happened, but I don't know where the hell they're going to find a buyer for something like that in rural Iowa.
Thus, we come full circle to how I started this account with looking at land and realizing land is amazing, especially farmland, and it is very valuable. And I'm glad for the people who get to sell it and profit off of that eventually. But if you're just wanting to experience that childhood nostalgia and have a little piece of land and then have a barn on it, it's not an easy combination.
So when we're talking about barns specifically in Georgia, I know like barns vary a lot regionally. There's, certain styles, there were certain builders, there are reasons for specific architecture depending where you lived. So what are for someone who hasn't been to Georgia before and driven the back roads, what are the typical types of barns that you're usually seeing?
So the first thing is we do not have the gorgeous giants that you have in Canada and Iowa and Indiana and Ohio and Pennsylvania. Those barns tend to be much more massive. Georgia barns are on average going to be much smaller. I am not the expert in the why behind that, but based on my farm upbringing, based on listening to great podcasts like you all, it really goes back to the long winters. You had to have a massive amount of whether it be hay, grain, whatever you were storing in there, versus you come down to the South in Georgia, in Florida, and Alabama. The winters aren't as harsh. You don't have to store up near as much. So why spend all that time and money on a giant barn when an average or small size barn will do? I think you see gambrel roof barns mostly when you drive around Georgia. And for a person who doesn't know what that is, when you think of a barn roof, that's what you think of. It's kind of symmetrical look on both sides with two different slopes, one being longer than the other. That's what you're going to most commonly see. You'll see gabled roof, basic barns. It's really incredible because of what I do, the variety that you find. I will say you don't see. I've done research on this. I don't think there's one round barn remaining in Georgia. There used to be a couple. I think we've lost those. A couple of very special barns. I think there are maybe 5 left in Georgia are the Rock City barns, if you're familiar with that. That is based on Rock City and outside of Chattanooga, Tennessee. It's this cool story about a very wise marketing mind back in, I believe, the 40s, 50s. He wanted to attract people to Rock City. And the deal was, I think for a very low amount of money, $35 or whatever, he would paint the roof of your barn and it would say, see Rock City or come to Rock City. And it was this great marketing message. And people got a free or very low cost roof repainted. And there were hundreds of these barns at one point, stretching all the way to Texas, I believe up into Ohio. Now there's maybe 70 some of these barns, but they are iconic. I purposely went and saw the closest Rock City barn. We pulled over the side of the road. I had my son and my nephew with me. The wheat field was like about to be cut. They had just repainted the roof of this barn. It looked amazing. It was on the highway. A gentleman pulled up. He goes, "That's my barn if you want to come get closer." This man was so proud of his barn. He bought the property because of that barn. He was restoring it, protecting it. He told me so many stories about it, let us have great access to it. So I don't remember the original question, but that's how much I like to talk about barns, that I can ramble on and on and on.
Nate, I'm going to try that tactic with our painting company and see if I can get them to paint our barn for free if I let them paint their name on the front. Because I think it's going to cost me a little more than $35 the next time the barn needs painted.
Get some advertising up there, throw some billboards on the side of it.
Make it look like a NASCAR suit. Just going to have sponsors all the way down.
We need a barnyard language roof somewhere in Canada, Iowa, maybe Georgia. A partnership seems like the thing to do. QR code going straight to your Patreon page.
Love the idea of a QR code on the roof. So I was actually going down to add a question about this, and I see that Arlene already had the same thought. It's really easy to forget that there are so many stories associated with these places. You know, our kids are the 5th generation on our farm. How do we document and preserve these farm stories? Because like Arlene said, it's pretty easy to start getting different versions of the same stories or totally different stories. And, you know, as they get passed down, a lot of them change and things get forgotten about. I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how to preserve that. And, you know, with social media, it's fantastic. It's a great way to connect, but all of that published content is at the mercy of somebody else. So what are your thoughts on, you know, especially as you're going around talking to all these old farmers and, you know, brainwashing your children?
I think it's very, very important. And if your listeners can hang with me, I actually have something to show you. This would be exclusive for your Patreon people to see. When I was thinking about history, when I was thinking about documenting, I thought of this very, very old book. I found this for 50 cents in a thrift store in the bottom of a box. And it is a copy of Pilgrim's Progress. It is going to fall apart in my hands as we look at it. there's an inscription in the front that says, "This book is to Amos Rogers, given to Amos Rogers by Amos Covey, his grandfather, in the year 1829, January 17th." So, what does that have to do with barns? What does that have to do with farms and preserving these things? Like, I found that in the bottom of a box in a thrift store, so it didn't get passed on to a family. So, this is maybe a terrible story. But to me, he took that time, he wrote that to his grandson. I'm reading that now. This is 40 years before the Civil War started. Like, this is almost 200 years since he wrote that in there. And I can share that with you on this podcast and tell people around the world about it. That's pretty special. But I think we get caught in this dilemma of thinking it's going to be easy to preserve things now because of technology. And my point is, you have to be very intentional. He took the time, he wrote this note to his grandson, it got preserved. So I think you have to start with, you got to do something. If you write it down, if you take a picture, I think video format is amazing. It is rich. You can get all the details, but you have to stitch that together and organize it. And coming back to what I'm passionate about is really telling farmers' stories. I haven't got there yet. It's my dream that I haven't quite grasped how I'm going to do yet. But when I think about my family farm, it is mainly oral history and then a scattering of photos in boxes. And now on my phone, when I looked at my phone this morning, synced to the iCloud, there was 40,000 pictures and videos on it. 20,000 barns, 20,000 of my kids probably. How do I organize that to pass that on to my kids, hopefully their kids, to remember, hey, this is where daddy grew up on this farm. This was my great great grandfather. He came from Germany. Like, all these stories are very unorganized, and I haven't figured it out yet. I do think there are some people working in this space to try to preserve some of these stories in a more organized way. But I think when I was thinking about how you do it the best way, my recommendation is there's usually one person in the family farm or non-farm, who's very passionate about the history. Let them lead. Other people may love it, may not like it in the family, but let them lead and let others come along and document it through writing, through photographs, through video. And hopefully there's some people like me that, as you can hear my voice, are as passionate about this as I am, that can help support this in some way. I haven't gotten there yet. I do have a YouTube channel. My YouTube channel is tiny. It's neglected. But the idea with it is medium to long form storytelling about these things that shouldn't just be oral history. They should be well documented for families to enjoy for decades to come.
I know Nate is someone who's married into a family and comes from a family where there is that random cardboard box full of photos, 600 of which are of tractors and 8 of them are of family members, and how often there are no names on any of those photographs as to who those people are. And even if they're your grandparents, I came across some photos of my grandma the other day when she was graduating high school, and that would have been 1929, and I was born in 81. So I wouldn't recognize her at 17 without a name on it. And, I was ordering my kids' school pictures the other day and making sure to have their names printed right on them. And I try to be pretty obsessive about putting names on the actual photograph, because if you don't know who the people are, it's kind of pointless to have the photograph. Just by family resemblance, you can usually tell if there's some sort of relative, but beyond that, the
And it's such a strange thing too to think, like our grandparents and great grandparents had a handful or maybe a few dozen photographs of their entire childhoods, where our kids have thousands of, have probably over documented every moment of their lives. And yet, you know, I for the first few years I was pretty good about actually printing photos and putting them in albums, but you just have so many and it becomes just one more thing to do. And the last few years, not very few pictures have gotten printed out, so they're my kids probably don't have that same connection to like what they look like as a baby because when I was little, my mom was one of those very organized people, and we each of us four kids had our own set of albums where it was like that's my baby, like my first few years, and like that album was mostly me, as like the primary kid in most of those pictures, but to think about the thousands of pictures that exist of my kids, and yet they probably haven't even seen them because they're just sitting on my phone or on my computer or somewhere in the cloud hanging out. And until, I'm like, all right, let's sit down and watch watch your childhood slideshow, they probably don't even know that they're there.
Yeah, I think it's a real dilemma of the massive amount of things we have, and we try to organize that versus this one book that I showed you, or versus that one album. It's almost easier to keep track of things and not feel overwhelmed. And I know, like I said, there's some good technology that click of a button on your phone, you can say load everything from this month, and a album will be printed and shipped to your house. But I think when you think of farm stories, when you think of the history of a barn, it is so much more detailed than that and deserves a way to really be documented in detail. I haven't figured out a silver bullet for that, but I'd love to help families figure that out. It is on my list to do that for our own family. I think I'm rambling on and on about how important it is. Guess what? I haven't done this for our family farm, but because of my account and kind of the space I have a hobby in now, it's a high priority here. Going home for Thanksgiving is going to be starting to take some of that footage that I think would be very special to have with my parents in it, with our kids in it, telling some of this history, incorporating other members of the family. Who knows where that'll go, but I think it'll resonate really well with our family. I think if you show that to other farmers or people who know your family, they would be like, that is special. We need to do the same thing for our family farm.
So you've been talking a lot about your own agriculture background and trying to raise your kids with similar experiences, not the same, but with some of those kind of farm-based values. And I'm sure there are a lot of people that listen to us that are in a similar situation who maybe came from a farm but aren't currently raising their kids on one. So you've already talked about some of the ways you're incorporating your kids, but what are some other ways that you're trying to be intentional about making sure that they have farm experiences, even living in the suburbs?
For sure. And I don't know if you've had a guest talk about this. I feel like you have. I've listened to enough of your episodes, but um, you have multi-generational farms, and then you have people like me, and I have an older sister and an older brother, and they're not planning to be on the farm either. And there's this guilt, maybe too strong of a word, but there's this feeling of, are you kind of the generation that breaks that chain? And I remember when we first had children, that hit me. And you start thinking about all the things you learned growing up on the farm, all those lessons, all those memories. And you say to yourself, are my kids going to miss that? And so luckily I had access to a very wise old farmer and my dad. And I can remember what we were doing. We were deer hunting, and I asked him about it. And he said, um, you you do what you can where you are with what you have. And so that just meant we were on a tiny, tiny lot in the middle of Atlanta at the time. And that just meant you make sure you're intentional about throwing some seeds in a tiny garden in the backyard and sticking your kids' hands in the dirt and having them watch a seed grow, right? And I've really taken that and ran as much as I could. We go to a rodeo every fall. We take the kids to the county fair. We go back home to the family farm as much as possible. It's tough, but we do it hopefully twice a year. And now we have this cool adventure with Barnes of Georgia, and we meet all these people. And so my kids will get less than 1% exposure to a farm compared to your kids, but in my mind, like way better than 0%, because that's how special a farm upbringing is in my mind.
And one thing we talk about a lot, Katie and I and our guests, is that, there's no one way to parent and there's no one way to farm. And, you know, for all of us, we all should be doing the best we can with what we have where we are, right? So there are experiences that all of our kids are going to have that are different and than the way we grew up and are different from their peers. but yeah, everyone's just doing the best they can, hopefully, or the best they can with what they have to work with, and they're going to have a completely different perspective on life than you did, and that's okay because they are also their own people. So, kind of on that note, do you have a piece of parenting advice, either not doesn't have to be farm related, but something that you've gained along the way that someone has, other than what your wise dad told you, that you would share with somebody else, or that you have learned and want to pass on?
If we were really giving your listeners something of value, this is where my wife would slide in right here and say, let me take the next 30 minutes. Um, I am really a believer in the seasons of life and embracing the season that you're in. When I think about this podcast and farmers can't fight the seasons, right? You can't say, no, I really want to grow X, Y, and Z, and I can only do it now, and it's the dead of winter. Or I really want to, have calves, but it's the wrong time of year. Like, you can't do that. You have to embrace the season that you're in. You have to deal with the weather. You have to deal with things that are out of your control. So when I think of parenting, and maybe it's that farming upbringing, I think of leaning into that season of life that our kiddos are in. And sometimes that's super hard, right? That's the tough stuff. That's the challenge that you're in with your kids. Sometimes that is the amazing things, and not taking it for granted and not thinking that it's going to last forever. Um, some people have told me, hey, your kids don't give you any warning when they're about to go out of, they don't give you like 3 weeks warning when they're about to go out of some phase that's super sweet and nice. You always hear that story about the kids who all of a sudden tell their parents, I don't need you to tuck me into bed anymore. And that just like breaks my heart. That's one of our favorite times at night. And so you just make the most of that season you're in, um, and you soak it all up, the good and the bad. That's what being a parent is all about. And I think that's what our kiddos need too.
Yeah, for sure. So, kind of related to that, what is a parenting struggle that you're having these days? Is there a particular season that you're in that are elements that are challenging for you at the moment?
We're very fortunate that I feel like our struggles right now are molehills compared to so many parents' mountains. And we've had some mountains of our own, right? When you deal with kids that have health issues or challenges, it gives you perspective like you've never had in your life. And we're in a season right now where we don't have those types of challenges. We did just 2 days ago start our son at a new school. So that's been a big one. We move out to the suburbs for great public school, and our public school that our daughter goes to is amazing, but our son has dyslexia and he needed different resources. And so we started him in a dyslexic remediation school 2 days ago. It has been 2 days. It has been amazing already. You can already tell it's what he needed. But when you talk about struggles, all of a sudden, logistically, mom and dad, I can lean a little bit and I can see our bus stop from here. So that's what we had. And now we're going to have to figure out the logistics of, an extra at least 30 minutes each way, combined with my wife's commute, combined with our schedules. It's going to be a struggle, but that's part of this season that we're in, and we'll get through it. And we know it's for good reasons for the kiddos.
All right, so we ask all of our guests, if you were going to dominate a category at the county fair, what would it be? Categories can be real or made up.
Kudos to whoever came up with this question. Whenever I listen to any episode, I love the answers to this. So I gave it some thought. Once again, it's probably due to the season that I'm in. I feel like I would dominate the youth sports coaching category. I love coaching our kids' teams. I'm usually an assistant coach because I try to be a coach for all of them. If I try to be the head coach, then that's going to pull me towards one or the other. But we wouldn't win all the games at the fair if I was the coach. We would have the most fun, and those kiddos would grow the most and learn the most and just get life perspective and be loved on and treated the right way, not overly competitive, but just the lessons you get through youth sports I think are invaluable.
Well, if you ever want to move to Iowa, we have a lot of barns, and we have a real shortage of youth coaches. And they actually tried to get me to coach last year for like softball or something. Like, I've never played softball in my life, and I'm probably the least athletic person in town. It's probably not a great choice for this, you guys.
I'll take.
I'm going to award you a ribbon for being that person who volunteers for all the teams, because any of us parents know that those positions are usually coerced or really, the kind of thing where it's like, okay, if you want your kid to play, someone's going to have to step up. So someone who's willing to do it and obviously passionate about it, that deserves a ribbon for sure. Now, you're American, so you get a blue ribbon, right? Because our first prize is red. So I always have to remember which one.
Yeah, and I think I love it. And once again, by example, from a farmer. My dad wasn't always our coach, but my dad was, when he was actively farming. He's retired now. He was farming. He was a school teacher. And when it came time to shoot baskets or batting practice, like, he made time for that. And of course, as an 8-year-old, as a 12-year-old, you do not understand the sacrifices he's making and how he's finding the time. And then you become an adult and you're like, these people are superheroes. So, if I can just be 1% of a superhero while I'm at being a youth sports coach, then that's pretty awesome.
That is awesome. So we'll go ahead and move into our cussing and discussing segment. So if you're a listener and want to submit yours, you can either use our SpeakPipe or send us an email. Both the links for that are in our show notes. Katie, what do you have to cuss and discuss this week? Is it barn related?
It's not. It's rural life related. The special level of logistics that rural life takes, or life in a place where you have a long commute to get to places, because I know that, doesn't Atlanta supposed to have like some of the worst traffic in the US or something, which is shocking to me, but I believe it because places have really got awful traffic. Um but just when you end up in the situation I'm in, where I have one errand to run in a town that is 17 miles east. I have one errand to run in a town that is literally 17 miles west. I have two errands to run in a town that is 7 miles south. All of these errands are at about the same level of importance. All of them have to take place during particular hours. And having to drive realistically 60 plus miles to run 3 or 4 quick errands is just maddening. I mean, we have robots for everything. Why can I not, and then I made the mistake of looking at the fact that they don't do 2-day prime shipping anymore. But in 90 cities across the US, you can get same-day Amazon shipping. But we can't even get 2-day shipping, and I have to go to one town for milk, and one town for license plates, and one town for library books, and it's just...
There are some things you just can't do online. You actually physically have to go and do the thing.
And I have to work at my quote-unquote real job because our barn needed a new roof last year. And
Yeah.
the bank wants their money.
This isn't supposed to be the blaming Barnes episode. This is supposed to be the loving Barnes episode.
Damn barns.
No, that's right. Just think of the joy that new roof has brought to you and your family, Katie.
The joy of not walking out to pick up shingles all over the yard every time it rains, and the joy of not listening to my family complain about how wet the hay is getting and having to tarp the hay in the hayloft, absolutely worth it. And the crew did a great job, and we got a decent price. But it's still a lot of money.
Your frustrations with rural America are at least 50% of the reason my wife would fist fight me if I tried to move us to rural America, which I would love and she would like many parts of, but she reminds me of the conveniences that we have and the access to things we have for our family. And it's a struggle. And that's part of the reason I care so much about rural America, because I know how hard people work. I know the sacrifices they make, and I know the frustrations they have to put up with. And I firmly believe that the benefits outweigh the struggles, but there's no lie. When you describe that, I can just think of running errands for parts during harvest season. You think it's no big deal, and 6 hours later, you're still not back to the farm.
I will admit that I'm incredibly spoiled because I work from home, so I really have no great call to leave the house usually. Um, as long as there's like chocolate and books and internet, I really have no reason to go anywhere. So when I do have to go somewhere, and especially if I have to go two places, it's just inhuman. The the stress, I just can't. Anyway, uh, Nate, what do you have to cuss and discuss today?
I'm on a seasons theme, so I was thinking about what's going on here in Georgia and why I love living here so much. And we get all the seasons. I'm probably going to be, you guys are probably going to cuss me as people who have to deal with hard winters and wonder why I'm rubbing this in your face. But we get to experience all the seasons. None of them, knock on wood, usually are too harsh. If we get a bad summer, that can be rough. And none of them are too long. And when we get extended ones, it tends to be spring and fall. And the reason I bring this up is because I'm looking out the window and the leaves are slightly starting to turn. The mornings are getting cool, and it's hard to beat fall season here in Georgia. So we're really excited about it.
Arlene, what do you have to cuss and discuss?
I'm going to loop back to our discussion about pictures because I am someone who really enjoys taking pictures. I, for a long time, had, like I worked at a photography store when I was a teenager, so I had like the big old camera with multiple lenses and loved to take photos and have so many photo albums and just that like simmering not guilt I guess, but like that idea that I really need to print off probably thousands of pictures at this point and put them in albums and write people's names on them because that's what I want to do. And yet I don't really want to face it either. So I probably should just figure out, a good photo book program that I can work with and get someone else to do the actual printing and actually get some things printed out because I do love having the ability to open up a photo album and look at some pictures and when you were talking about documenting farm life, we're really lucky. My husband's grandmother was 99 when she passed this past summer, but she had written a history of the farm and had done a lot of genealogy stuff and wrote it all down for us and made multiple copies for the different families. And probably at the time she handed it to us, we didn't really appreciate it that much, but having a lot of the pictures in one place, like she had someone else scan them and put them into these books for us and wrote down, when certain renovations happened on the farm and they spent a $200 here or there on a something in the barn or in the house, and she documented all those types of things. So it is really neat to look back on the stories of the place where we live now and have someone who did the work of writing it down. So we'll try and keep up her tradition and actually pencil some things down and add some pages to her book over the years because it is quite valuable to have those things in our possession.
She was the leader who stepped up for the family and
Yes, yeah, she did.
just had a thought because you all are podcasters or you do that as part of the many hats you wear. I wonder if one of the easiest ways is to record that oral history. And so maybe there's an episode, or maybe just because you guys are pros at it, each of you do that recorded oral history. Then you can get it into writing. Then you can come along with the photos and videos. But it's probably a really, the lowest friction way to get started. Now that I think about it, is to record that oral history.
Yeah, because a lot of these programs have transcription already built right into them. Yeah, so the step of getting it written down, if someone's willing to talk to you and answer questions, then the writing down part isn't actually all that daunting anymore. The robots will do it for us, right, Katie?
Right, the AI.
Nate, that's actually part of why I started this podcast, honestly, was that I had been dealing with a really scary health situation, and I realized that my kids were so little that they wouldn't have any memory of me. There would be nothing from my perspective. And now they have probably 500 hours of me yammering on about random shit.
And other people too.
And other people too. But they can literally hear what I'm interested in. And I don't know, I think that's really exciting.
That I think it's very special, and you were wise to do that. And, 10 years from now, 20 years from now, they'll be like, why did they interview a guy from Georgia who was obsessed with barns? But hey, we did it.
But we've already met him because he's been here to see the barn 3 times, and it's getting kind of weird.
I like where we're going with this. I like where we're going with this.
There you go. So thank you so much, Nate, for joining us. If people want to follow you online, want to send you pictures of their barns, where should they find you?
Barns of Georgia on Instagram and on YouTube. I'm much more active on Instagram. And yes, I would love anyone wants to send me to a barn in Georgia, anyone wants to share photos, Georgia or any other state, Canada, countries, bring it on. As you can tell, I love a good barn.
Thank you so much. It was great to meet with you and have this chat today.
Great. Thanks, Nate.
Thank you both. It was an honor.
Thank you for joining us on Barnyard Language. If you enjoyed the show, please support us on Patreon with a donation.
Big thanks go out to our show editor, Krista Paffrath at the Rural Podcast Network.
Please rate and review the podcast wherever you listen and follow the show so you never miss an episode.
If you want to connect with other farming families, join the private Barnyard Language Facebook group.
We are always in search of future guests for the podcast. If you or someone you know would like to chat with us, get in touch.